Hello everybody, at this time we are talking about economic surplus. Economic surplus, often termed social surplus, refers to the net benefits enjoyed by consumers and producers in the marketplace. It highlights the efficiency of resource allocation, measuring the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and the actual market price. Consumers benefit to the degree they pay a price less than the maximum price they were willing to pay. This is called the consumer surplus. Producers benefit from getting any price above the minimum price they're willing to accept. This is called the producer surplus. Total economic surplus combines all the varying amounts of individual consumer and producer surplus. The balance of economic surplus between consumers and producers is constantly changing, a reflection of fluctuating prices in marketplaces. And then, what are the different types of economic surplus? Economic surplus has two parts to it: consumer surplus and producer surplus. The first about consumer surplus. A consumer surplus refers to the monetary benefit that a consumer receives when purchasing a good for a lower price than the top amount that be willing to pay in that scenario. The consumer surplus refers to the marginal benefit or the highest price they pay minus what they actually paid. And then the second, producer surplus. Producer surplus refers to the monetary gain that producers get by selling a particular good above the lowest price that they'd be willing to sell at. The marginal cost refers to the incremental cost that a producer has when producing more of a particular good. When there is equilibrium among both consumer surplus and producer surplus, both the marginal benefit as well as the marginal cost are the same value. And then, what causes economic surplus? Economic surplus is the result of market efficiency, meaning buyers and sellers share some of the benefits of transactions in such a way as to lead to the maximum net benefit. And then the idea, especially the idea of marketing efficiency, is connected to the economic principle of supply and demand. From the diagram of economic surplus, we know that the horizontal axis measures supply, the quantity of a particular good producers provide, while the vertical axis tracks demand for the good measured by price. Markets typically look to achieve a balance to some degree, with supply and demand fluctuating as consumers and producers seek equilibrium. As a result, economic surplus fluctuates. In competitive markets with many producers, prices generally are lower, and consumers get a bigger portion of the total surplus. In markets dominated by one or a few producers with some pricing power. The producers get a bigger share of economic surplus. And then, how is economic surplus calculated? Economic surplus is calculated by adding the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. Consumer surplus is calculated by subtracting the actual price consumers pay from the price they are willing to pay. Producer surplus is calculated by subtracting the actual price producers receive from the minimum price at which they would be willing to sell. And then we move to correlation between economic surplus with supply and demand. Economic surplus has a direct correlation to supply and demand in any market. Producers would be willing to supply more goods into the market when they are able to fetch a maximum price at any given time. Likewise, consumers would be willing to purchase goods and services in bulk when they are able to purchase them at desired prices. Similarly, the two forces must come to equilibrium to be able to get what they need from the market. A producer should be convinced that the prevailing market prices would lead to a higher producer surplus to be able to supply the market. Likewise, the consumer should be convinced the prevailing market price amounts to a significant discount. The intersection of supply and demand curves especially often gives rise to the market price of as well as the quantity of goods up for sale. However, before the two curves intersect, there is usually a big space that indicates the price consumers are willing to pay for an item is much higher than what producers would be. And then, how economic surplus works. Economic surplus refers to the respective gains that a consumer or producers gets within an economic activity and is the combined benefit, sometimes referred to as total welfare. It can also be referred to as total surplus or community surplus as well. This economic metric is used to evaluate wellness in the markets. When a consumer scores an item for less than that be willing to pay, the consumer is getting a surplus. When a producer sells a good for more than minimum price they are willing to sell at, the producer is getting a surplus. Economic surplus follows the rules of supply and demand. Businesses generally want to earn as much profit as possible without alienating consumers, while consumers typically want to feel as though they're scoring a deal. When the supply and demand of consumers and producers are in good shape, the market is in what is called equilibrium or allocative efficiency. And then we move to the role of surplus in market dynamics. Economic surplus is integral to understanding market dynamics as it serves as a barometer for the balance between supply and demand. A surplus in the market, often referred to as excess supply, can lead to price reductions as sellers compete to attract buyers. This can be beneficial for consumers as they can purchase goods at lower prices. Conversely, a persistent surplus may signal an oversupply relative to demand, suggesting that producers need to scale back production or innovate to stimulate demand. Analyzing surplus helps economists and policymakers gauge the health of the economy and make informed decisions regarding interventions to promote market efficiency and economic well-being. I think it is enough. Thanks for watching.